I knew the homeowners association was bad news, but I never thought they'd go this far. The first time I met Karen Billings, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, she marched up my gravel driveway like she owned the place. Short, sharp haircut, aggressively beige cardigan, and that ever-present clipboard clutched in her hands like a weapon. "This structure is in violation of the community aesthetic," she declared, jabbing a finger toward my cabin. I leaned against my truck, arms crossed. "It's not in your jurisdiction," Karen scoffed. "This land was meant to be part of our HOA, but the previous owner refused to sign the agreement. That doesn't mean we can allow unsightly structures to bring down property values." I had bought this cabin to get away from people like her. It sat on 10 acres of woodland, just outside the so-called HOA boundary. I had checked the property records myself, no covenants, no agreements, nothing tying me to their ridiculous rules. Karen, however, had a different interpretation. She left that day muttering about fixing the situation. I didn't take her seriously. That was my first mistake. The second mistake was underestimating just how far she was willing to go. It happened while I was out of town for work. I came back, expecting the peaceful retreat I had spent years restoring. Instead, I found a leveled plot of dirt where my cabin used to stand. I stood frozen, my brain struggling to process the sight. The wooden beams, the stone fireplace, the porch swing I built with my own hands gone. Just a pile of splintered wood and crushed memories. Then I saw the sign planted right in the middle of the wreckage. "This property is now under review for community development, HOA compliance required." I felt my pulse hammer in my skull. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. This was Karen. I stormed into the HOA office the next morning, barely keeping my composure. Karen sat behind her oversized desk, sipping tea like she hadn't just destroyed my home. "You tore down my cabin," I said, my voice dangerously low. Karen set down her cup. "It was an illegal structure." Illegal. I laughed, though there was nothing funny about it. "I own that land outright. Your HOA has no claim." She gave me an infuriatingly smug look. "We recently voted to expand the HOA boundaries. Your parcel is now under our governance. And since your structure did not meet community standards, it had to be removed." I stared at her, barely believing the words coming out of her mouth. "You expanded the HOA without my consent," she shrugged. "It was a unanimous vote among the board members." I clenched my fists. "I never signed anything. You didn't have to. The HOA has the authority to annex adjacent properties if doing so benefits the community." I took a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "You're going to pay for this." Karen gave me a condescending smile. "I'd be careful, dear. Fighting the HOA is expensive." She thought she had won. She thought I was just another homeowner who would grovel and beg for their mercy. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I walked out of that office with a plan forming in my mind. If the HOA thought they could bulldoze my home and get away with it, they were in for a rude awakening. Because I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to own them. I left the HOA office with my mind racing, barely able to contain the fury boiling inside me. Karen had no legal right to take my property, let alone demolish my home. I wasn't just going to let this slide. I was going to make sure she regretted every single decision that led her to this point. But rage alone wouldn't win this fight. I needed a strategy. The first stop was the county records office. I spent hours combing through property deeds, zoning laws, and HOA regulations. I wasn't a lawyer, but I knew how to read legal documents, and what I found made my blood run hot. Karen and her board had overstepped their authority in ways that could land them in serious trouble. HOAs could only annex properties if the landowners agreed in writing. I had never signed a thing. That meant their so-called expansion was fraudulent. Even worse for them, demolishing my cabin without a court order or due process was not just illegal, it was criminal destruction of private property. I took copies of every relevant document, then called in a favor. My old buddy, Marcus, was a real estate attorney with a reputation for tearing corrupt HOAs apart. He owed me one from back when I helped him out of a tight spot, and when I explained what happened, he was more than happy to return the favor. Marcus wasted no time drafting a lawsuit. We hit the HOA with multiple claims: illegal annexation, destruction of private property, trespassing, and financial damages. By the time we were done, the potential fines and restitution would bankrupt them, but I wasn't stopping there. Destroying my home wasn't just an attack on me, it was a power play to intimidate the entire neighborhood. I needed to turn that fear against the HOA. I started knocking on doors, talking to homeowners who'd been under Karen's rule for years. The stories they told me were worse than I imagined. Arbitrary fines, threats of foreclosure, and endless bullying. Karen ran the HOA like a dictatorship, using fear and manipulation to keep everyone in line. But now, people were angry. With Marcus's help, I organized a community meeting at a local cafe. Dozens of homeowners showed up, most of them fed up with Karen's reign. I laid out my plan. If we could prove widespread corruption, we could vote to dissolve the HOA entirely. It wouldn't be easy. Karen had stacked the board with her loyalists, but if we got enough homeowners on our side, we could force a leadership change. The first step was exposing her crimes publicly. Marcus filed the lawsuit, making sure the local media got a copy. The story spread fast. HOA president illegally bulldozes homeowners' property was the kind of scandal that got people's attention. News crews started showing up, shoving cameras in Karen's face every time she stepped outside. She tried to spin it as a necessary action for community improvement, but nobody was buying it. Then came the financial bombshell. Marcus discovered that Karen had been siphoning HOA funds for years, using them for consulting fees that went straight into her personal account. We compiled the evidence and handed it over to the district attorney. When the fraud charges hit, the HOA board panicked. Several members resigned on the spot, desperate to distance themselves from Karen, and that's when I made my next move. With the HOA crumbling, I approached the remaining board members with an offer. I would buy out the HOA entirely. They laughed at first, then I showed them the numbers. The lawsuit had wiped out their reserves. They were facing bankruptcy, and the only way to settle their debts was to liquidate assets, including the HOA itself. Karen fought it tooth and nail, but she had no allies left. In the end, she had no choice but to watch as I took over the very organization she had used to terrorize homeowners for years. The first thing I did as the new owner of the HOA, I dissolved it. No more pointless fines, no more power-hungry board members, no more Karen. And then I rebuilt my cabin, twice as large, with a towering stone fireplace and a wraparound porch that overlooked the forest. Every piece of lumber, every nail, every brick was a statement. I had won. When I threw a housewarming party, the entire neighborhood showed up. People laughed, shared stories, and for the first time in years, they didn't have to worry about some petty tyrant breathing down their necks. As for Karen, she packed up and left town, her reputation in ruins. Last I heard, she was trying to start over in another HOA. But something told me she'd never regain the power she once had. Because this time, people knew better. With Karen gone and the HOA formally dissolved, the neighborhood had a newfound sense of freedom. No more arbitrary rules, no more ridiculous fines, and no more fear of waking up to find a bulldozer parked on the property. But while the battle had been won, there was still unfinished business. Rebuilding my cabin had been the first step, but I had no intention of stopping there. The HOA had drained the community for years, and it was time to set things right. I started by organizing a restitution fund with the last remnants of the HOA's assets. Marcus helped set up a legal pathway to redirect the remaining money toward the homeowners, who had been unfairly fined or extorted under Karen's rule. People who had been forced to pay for unnecessary repairs, bogus violations, or outright fraudulent fees were finally getting their money back. The first checks went out, and the reactions were better than I could have hoped. Some people were in disbelief, others were outright emotional. One elderly couple had been fighting off foreclosure thanks to Karen's manufactured debts. When they received their reimbursement, they hugged me so tightly I thought my ribs might crack. But financial justice wasn't enough. Karen had spent years manipulating homeowners into believing they needed her authority. She had controlled people through intimidation and bureaucracy, keeping them too exhausted to push back. I wanted to make sure that never happened again. so I got to work on something bigger. The land that had once belonged to the HOA was now under my control, including the community center Karen had used as her personal throne room. I repurposed it into a shared space for the neighborhood. No membership fees, no board approvals, just an open gathering place where people could meet, organize events, and actually enjoy their own community. The first event we hosted was a cookout. Word spread fast, and before long, nearly every homeowner showed up. People brought homemade dishes, kids ran across the open lawn, and for the first time in years, there was real laughter and conversation in the air. As the sun dipped, I stood back and took it all in. This was what a neighborhood was supposed to be. Not a kingdom ruled by a petty tyrant, not a battlefield of endless disputes, but a place where people actually felt at home. Marcus walked up beside me, plate in hand. He had a grin, clearly enjoying the results of our work. "Not bad for a guy who just wanted some peace and quiet," he said. I chuckled. "Didn't exactly plan on taking over an entire HOA, but here we are." He nodded toward the crowd. "They needed this. You know that, right?" I did, and I wasn't done yet. There was still the matter of Karen herself. She had disappeared in disgrace, but I had no doubt she would try to worm her way into another HOA somewhere else. She had spent too long wielding power to give it up entirely. So before she could regroup, I made sure she could never pull these kinds of stunts again. Marcus and I had already handed over enough evidence to the district attorney to ensure criminal charges stuck. But I took an extra step by reaching out to every HOA watchdog group I could find. We compiled a record of her abuses, her fraud, and her illegal annexation attempts, making sure her name was flagged in every homeowner's rights forum and legal database out there. She wouldn't be able to slip into another community unnoticed. By the time I finished tying up the last of the loose ends, it felt like a weight had finally lifted. A few weeks later, I stood on the porch of my rebuilt cabin, coffee in hand, watching the early morning mist roll through the trees. The place was even better than before, stronger, more secure, and built with the knowledge that no one would ever be able to take it from me again. I had gone up against a corrupt HOA and won. But the real victory was seeing a neighborhood that had once lived in fear finally reclaim its freedom. And with that, I finally had what I came here for in the first place: peace. With the HOA dismantled and my cabin standing strong once more, life in the neighborhood finally started to settle into something that resembled normalcy. People no longer dreaded the sight of an envelope from the HOA, no longer tiptoed around their own properties in fear of receiving a fine for something as trivial as leaving their trash been out a few hours too long. The air felt lighter, like the entire community had taken a collective breath after years of suffocation. But while Karen was gone, her mess still lingered. The financial damage she had inflicted on the neighborhood was deeper than many had realized. While Marcus and I had ensured that restitution checks went out to those she had wrongfully fined, there were still lingering debts, misplaced funds, and half-finished improvement projects that had been nothing more than thinly veiled excuses for siphoning money. One of the worst was the so-called Community Beautification Initiative. Karen had torn up several sidewalks and even ripped out a perfectly functional playground under the pretense of upgrading it. But instead of replacing what she had removed, she had left gaping, unfinished patches of dirt and construction debris. The funds allocated for the project had mysteriously vanished into administrative costs, which, after a little digging, turned out to be nothing more than a funnel into her personal account. The sight of kids playing in the dirt where a playground used to be didn't sit right with me. I knew I wasn't in this alone. The community had already rallied behind me when we took Karen down, and now they were more than willing to lend a hand in fixing what she had ruined. I called a meeting at the old HOA office, which had since been converted into a community center. The turnout was impressive. Homeowners who had once avoided these types of gatherings, fearing another round of arbitrary rule changes, now showed up ready to pitch in. We went over the remaining damage, dividing tasks among volunteers. Contractors in the neighborhood offered their services at cost, while others pitched in with manual labor. The playground was the first thing to be restored. We pooled together what was left of the HOA's liquidated assets and combined it with a fundraiser to replace the equipment. Within weeks, the empty dirt lot transformed into something vibrant, a new playground with sturdy swings, a jungle gym, and a freshly painted basketball court. Seeing the kids rush onto it for the first time, their laughter ringing through the air, was worth every ounce of effort. But the real challenge came when we started digging into the structural damage Karen had caused. Several roads had been left half-paved, with patches of loose gravel and poorly filled potholes. Streetlights that had once stood tall had been removed, leaving sections of the neighborhood dark at night. Worst of all, some homeowners discovered that Karen had misfiled key maintenance requests, allowing critical infrastructure to fall into disrepair. One night, as I walked through the neighborhood to check on our progress, I noticed an older man struggling with a busted water main in his front yard. Water gushed from a broken pipe, flooding his lawn and creeping toward the foundation of his house. I grabbed a wrench from my truck and waded into the mess with him. Together, we managed to cut off the flow, but the damage had already been done. He explained that he had filed multiple repair requests through the HOA years ago, only to be ignored. Karen had been too busy lining her own pockets to care about something as mundane as infrastructure upkeep. That was the final straw. The next morning, Marcus and I met with city officials. Since the HOA had officially been dissolved, the neighborhood no longer fell under its private jurisdiction. That meant city services could now step in where the HOA had failed. We pushed for emergency funding to repair the damage Karen had left behind, armed with documentation proving years of mismanagement and negligence. The city agreed, allocating funds to repave roads, restore streetlights, and repair water lines. Work crews arrived within weeks, finally giving the neighborhood the attention it had been denied for so long. As the repairs took shape, something incredible happened. The neighborhood, once fractured under the weight of HOA tyranny, started coming together in ways I had never expected. People who had barely spoken to their neighbors before now worked side by side, helping each other rebuild. One evening, as I stood on my newly rebuilt porch, a group of homeowners stopped by. They carried a wooden plaque, carefully engraved with the words, "In honor of fighting for our home, a community united." They handed it to me, insisting it belonged on the wall of the community center. I had never been one for grand gestures, but looking at their faces, the gratitude, the relief, the strength, I realized this wasn't about me. It was about all of us. The plaque found its place in the center's main hall, a reminder of what we had overcome. With Karen's damage undone and the neighborhood thriving, I finally felt like I could breathe. My cabin stood taller than ever, not just as a home, but as a symbol of resilience. And as I sat on the porch, watching the sunset cast golden light over the trees, I knew one thing for certain. No one would ever let an HOA like Karen's take control of this place again. With the neighborhood restored, and the scars of the HOA's reign fading into memory, I had finally begun to enjoy the peace I had fought so hard for. But something kept gnawing at me. Karen might have been exposed, humiliated, and removed from power, but I knew people like her didn't just disappear. They regrouped, schemed, and found new ways to worm their way back into control. I wasn't about to let that happen. I started digging into where she had gone after she left town. It didn't take long before I found something interesting. Karen had resurfaced in another HOA, a few towns over, taking a seat on the board of a struggling community association. The place had been in financial trouble for a while, and she had swooped in under the guise of helping them reorganize. I had seen this play before. She wasn't helping. She was setting herself up to take over. I wasn't going to let another neighborhood suffer the way mine had. Marcus and I spent a few nights researching the new HOA, pulling records and looking for familiar patterns. Sure enough, fines had skyrocketed the moment Karen stepped in. Homeowners were already complaining about aggressive enforcement and sudden rule changes. It was happening all over again. I reached out to a few residents, introducing myself as someone who had dealt with Karen before. At first, they were hesitant, unsure if they could trust an outsider. But when I shared what she had done to my property, The illegal annexation, the fraudulent fees, and the financial mismanagement, they started opening up. One homeowner, a retired school principal named Alina, had been fined for having a wreath on her door that did not match the seasonal color palette. Another, a single father named Louis, had been threatened with foreclosure over a late payment that turned out to be a clerical error on the HOA's part. It was the same playbook, just a different stage. I wasn't about to let Karen get away with it again. Marcus and I devised a plan. I had taken down one corrupt HOA before, and I knew exactly how to do it again. The first step was collecting evidence. I had learned from my own battle that the key to dismantling an abusive HOA was documentation. I urged homeowners to save every notice, every fine, every interaction with Karen. The second step was exposing her. I reached out to a local journalist who had covered my battle with Karen before. She was more than happy to run a follow-up story, this time shining a light on Karen's new HOA. The article detailed her past abuses and how she had resurfaced to do it all over again. The community started to turn against her. With the homeowners now aware of who they were dealing with, they began pushing back. They demanded transparency, audited financial records, and questioned every decision Karen made. It didn't take long before the cracks started to show. Then came the legal blow. Marcus discovered that Karen had failed to properly file financial disclosures required by state law. It was a serious violation, one that could get her removed from the board entirely. When we presented the evidence to the residents, they wasted no time calling an emergency vote. Karen tried to fight it, but this time she had no power to manipulate the outcome. The homeowners voted her out. For the second time, she was dethroned. This time, there was no graceful exit. She was escorted out of the HOA office by security, her belongings packed into hastily grabbed boxes. The look on her face was one of pure disbelief. She had thought she could start over, rebuild her little empire, but she had underestimated how far her reputation had spread. With Karen gone, the HOA immediately began reversing her policies, refunding unjust fines and restoring a sense of fairness to the community. Homeowners who had once been afraid to speak up now stood together, stronger than ever. As I drove back to my own neighborhood, I finally felt like I could close this chapter of my life. Karen had tried to take everything from me, but in the end, all she had done was show me how to be stronger. And now, she would never hold power over another neighborhood again. With Karen gone for good and 2 neighborhoods freed from her grip, I finally felt like I could move on. The past few months had been a whirlwind of legal battles, community rebuilding, and exposing corruption. But now, I could finally enjoy the life I had originally set out to build. My cabin, now twice as large as before, stood as a testament to resilience. Every inch of it had been built with purpose-stronger wood, reinforced beams, and a stone fireplace that radiated warmth even on the coldest nights. I had added a second-story loft, a larger workshop in the back, and a wide wraparound porch where I could sit and enjoy the peace I had fought so hard to reclaim. The neighborhood had transformed too. Without the suffocating grip of an HOA, people had started making their houses their own again. Yards that had once been forced into uniformity now reflected the personalities of the people who lived there, flower beds bursting with color, porches decorated with handcrafted furniture, and even a few homes painted in bold colors that would have sent Karen into a frenzy. The community center, no longer a place of rigid enforcement, had become a hub of activity. Residents organized potlucks, game nights, and even a weekend farmers market where local growers and artisans sold their goods. Kids played freely in the park we had restored, their laughter filling the air without fear of someone telling them they were being too loud. One evening, as the autumn air turned crisp, I found myself sitting on my porch, watching the golden hues of the sunset stretch across the treetops. Marcus stopped by, a 6-pack of craft beer in hand, and took a seat in one of the Adirondack chairs I had built. He leaned back, taking a long sip before glancing toward the horizon. The silence between us was comfortable, the kind that only comes when you've been through a war together and come out on the other side. Eventually, he spoke. You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't fought back? He asked. I thought about it for a moment. If I had backed down, if I had let Karen and her HOA get away with bulldozing my home, I wouldn't be sitting here now. I wouldn't have my land, my cabin, or the community that had rallied together in the wake of her downfall. Karen would still be in power, terrorizing homeowners, growing bolder with every manufactured fine and fabricated rule. No, I said finally, because I never would have let that happen. Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, I figured as much. We sat in silence again, watching as the last of the sunlight dipped below the tree line. The world felt right for the first time in a long time. As the weeks passed, life settled into a steady rhythm. I spent my days working on small projects around the cabin, helping neighbors with repairs, and enjoying the quiet I had earned. The stress of fighting an HOA had faded into a story people told newcomers how a stubborn homeowner had taken down a corrupt president and freed an entire community. One afternoon, while I was in town picking up supplies, I ran into Alina, the retired school principal from the other neighborhood Karen had tried to take over. She was standing at the counter of a small diner, chatting with the owner as she sipped a cup of coffee. When she saw me, she waved me over. She looked happier, lighter even. The worry lines that had been so prominent when I first met her had softened, replaced with a quiet confidence. She thanked me for what I had done, not just for their neighborhood, but for showing them they didn't have to accept the abuse of power. She told me how the community had rallied after Karen's removal, how they had rewritten their HOA bylaws to ensure no one could ever seize control like that again. It was good to hear. As we talked, she mentioned something that caught my attention. After Karen's second downfall, word had spread. Other communities, ones suffering under similar HOA dictators, had started reaching out, asking for advice on how to fight back. I hadn't expected that. I had fought my battle because it was personal, but now, it seemed like it had become something bigger. People were realizing they didn't have to live in fear of power-hungry boards and arbitrary rules. They were organizing, standing up for themselves, and refusing to be pushed around. It made me wonder how many more Karens were out there. How many more homeowners were being bullied into submission, afraid to speak up. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with that thought just yet, but it stayed with me as I drove back home, the winding road leading me through the trees that had once been threatened by Karen's so-called development plans. As I pulled into my driveway, stepping out to the familiar scent of pine and earth, I knew one thing for certain. I had built this home to be a place of peace, but if another battle ever came knocking, I wouldn't hesitate to fight again. For now, though, I would enjoy what I had earned, and that was enough.